Nice to be here. Today I just want to set the debate in a wider context. Local devolution, some reflections on the neighbourhood level. Again, as a traditional academic, let's start with the definition. When I refer to the neighbourhood level, just use Vivian Lowndes and Helen Sullivan's rather run seal. It does what it says on the tin. Arrangements for collective decision making and or service delivery at the sub-local level. So, just to start with a personal view of things, past as a foreign country, they do things differently there. Just the first point, just my own experience, and again, I started when I was 11, just to say, I've evaluated every single initiative from Urban Programme, City Challenge, SRB in South Tyneside, Northumberland and Durham. I was on the national evaluation of the Housing Action Trusts with Angela Hull, former colleague here, and I was on the national evaluation team for New Deal for Communities, and I was on the interim board that helped set up the Newcastle Westgate NDC, and as ever, good to see Nigel here, who will have his own experiences of the Newcastle NDC. Again, it was a formative time when we used to refer to area-based initiatives, ABIs, and I've got some fantastic experiences on the Newcastle NDC. The interim board was full of male, pale and stale, people with suits, famous meeting up in the West End when the residents threw us out. It was a famous suits out meeting. I was very annoyed because I just had a sports jacket on. I evaluated the West Middlesbrough NDC, sat in on a board meeting with very senior people. Joan Ford chaired it. Why is that interesting? Joan Ford was the cleaner of the building and she was a resident member of the West Middlesbrough board. She got the OBE quite rightly. And again, another famous memory, presenting some of the interim findings with my friend Paul Lawless from Sheffield to the government minister, Mr Tony McNulty, so it shows you how long ago it was, at the Hilton Hotel in Leeds. Conferences on deprived areas and poverty were always held in posh hotels. I've never quite worked that out. And at the end of, well, nothing really to show yet, takes time, Tony said to me, "Son, have you got any effing good news whatsoever?" So, memories there of resident involvement and top-down pressures from the local authority, impatience with government at the speed of progress, and some of the fantastic resident involvement in the scheme. So again, that's my memories of what was an interesting period, and I'm going to reflect on those today. But there's been a profound change. Summing up, I think this was the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, speaking about the social exclusion unit. Within 10 to 20 years, no one is seriously disadvantaged by where they live. Ah, right, things have changed. And again, breaking with the pattern of the last 40 years of area-based targeting on neighbourhood renewal. Ruth Lipton from the University of Manchester summed it up. Neighbourhood renewal, as we know under Labour, is dead. So what I want to do today is to look at three issues relating to that change from the work I did for many years and how the neighbourhood agenda has shifted. And I'll look at three issues. I want to briefly capture the fairly profound nature of the change from neighbourhood renewal to the big society. Clearly, there are real problems for neighbourhood working, given the pincer movement of austerity localism and the devolution deals. However, and the penny dropped with me during my time on the national evaluation of the New Deal for Communities, that we were telling residents too much what they should be doing. And my own view is that whatever we think, and I'll pose some of the challenges here, the localism, the neighbourhood agenda that we have at the moment, there are opportunities for genuine bottom-up initiatives that meet local need, often by mistake or by default, but I still think that there are real opportunities in some of the projects we'll hear about later on, and some of the people who have spoke at the previous seminar series meetings. And I think Jess Steele, who works for Locality and is now involved in the Community Organisers Programme, summed up, I think, my message for today. Only forward-thinking and inventive neighbourhoods are likely to successfully navigate and negotiate the policy landscape they now face. So it's not easy, but there are real successes, and how and why these local level neighbourhood initiatives work, I think we can touch on today. So those are the three issues, but I think the quote from Jess Steele who I think was awarded the CBE recently, as was my Vice-Chancellor, Professor Andrew Wathy. And of course it was a personal award for all Northumbria staff, can I just put it that way. Right, profound change. Little left of the architecture that I remember. Remember SCU, NRU, NRF, NM, HMR, NDC, NRA? Yeah, I'll stop you with that. But Neighbourhood Renewal Advisors, Neighbourhood Renewal Fund, Neighbourhood Management Pathfinders, Housing Market Renewal Pathfinders, NDC. That's just been decluttered, removed. Ironically, there are some positive aspects of that decluttering, which I'll come to. I don't know what I'm doing. Which I'll come to in a moment. Substantial drop in resources available to neighbourhoods and communities. I did work out that the cost of the national evaluation of New Deal for communities, or as somebody referred to it as New Deal for consultants, was just between 15 and 20 million. That's about the total monies available over the next 3 years for support and advice for neighbourhood planning. So let's be clear here, fundamental reduction in resources going to neighbourhoods. Clearly, end of the direct link between government interventions and deprivation and the use of the indicators for multiple deprivation. That's now really not used as an article of policy. Rescaling, people's interests politically seem to have, in terms of scalar issues, if there's some human geographers in the room, I'll use the word again, scalar, just to make you feel at home. It's all, well, obviously, it was LEPS after 2011. It's now city deals, Devo deals, and the Northern Poorhouse. Oh, sorry, the Northern Powerhouse. And that's an important issue because my view, which I'll conclude with, is if neighbourhood working's to work, you've got to make connections further up the scale, and you can't just be little islands of hope within a sea of indifference. That's pretty good. That. Sorry. Anyway, the other thing, which I feel a bit like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. It's a fairly sharp break from previous approaches. We never, ever learn about regenerating communities' neighbourhoods. There's a big literature on policy learning, but when you think the time I've spent on evaluation in my professional career, time, energy, money, and we sort of scrapped it, jumped it, and there's a real danger that we'll not learn the lessons. Men in Black, the movie, when you become a man in black, Tommy Lee Jones flicks something at you and your memory goes and you can't remember where you were before that moment. That's what it's like in terms of learning from neighbourhood renewal policies. And again, the other day I did notice that reinventing the wheel is always a very popular pastime. And as someone who helped evaluate the Housing Action Trusts for the then ODPM, recently the Prime Minister announced an estates renewal programme to tackle problems of rundown estates and allocated, by Jove, £120 million. And the whole speech by the Prime Minister could have been cut and pasted from the national evaluation of the Housing Action Trusts at the turn of 2000. So we don't learn lessons, and one of the corollaries of that is we end up reinventing the wheel. But let's not have any mistake here, there are profound changes. Right, second question. Issues about austerity localism. Clearly there are critics of the localist big society agenda, and some of them clearly are appropriate. Now, there's a lot of literature and it cuts across the disciplines. The present localist agenda is merely to transfer responsibility of cuts and services downwards. I think the postmodernists would say you're being responsibilised. So, you're getting responsibility without the funding or resources to actually achieve something. So it's a sort of Jamie Peck in quite a famous article called Austerity Urbanism in 2012. Actually, I knew Jamie when he was young. It could be a feature of neoliberalism generally, and austerity that you transfer responsibilities downwards. So it's a very odd form of empowering. You're being empowered to be in charge of your own failure, which is a rather odd issue. Big society's gone. I'm pretty sure it'll probably achieve the status of mainstreaming. Put your hands up if you remember that. Remember worklessness, whatever happened to work? I just think the big society is just generally where it was about non-state actors, of which there's many representatives in the room today. That's sort of got off the agenda. It's now an economic growth-led agenda. empowering combined authorities and metropolitan mayors. Third issue within that, and I'll come to this later on, it's fundamentally about bypassing local authorities and elected members. One profound issue about neighbourhood working is, and obviously Nigel's here today, but what's the role of the elected member within the neighbourhood working? And it's a real tension there. But the government, by and large, don't want local authorities making that many decisions, and by and large, see elected mayors as a way of circumventing the existing political system. Actually, I do remember about 30 years ago, two sociologists at the University of Sussex, Alan Corson and Peter Saunders, who later on became a right-wing academic, they coined the phrase dual state, where economic key decisions about the economy and private profit are insulated at one level, and at the other level it's social. There is democratic issues there, but the two things never actually square up. Clearly, we're exacerbating spatial inequalities, relying on trickle-down, uneven development, movement away from targeting on the basis of deprivation. Since we've effectively given that up, we are facing the issue of considerable inequalities. And again, as a neighbourhood planning forum or a neighbourhood initiative, one does face the obvious point that you have quite uneven development across small spaces, and it does often result in a very complex system of inequality. And very finally, and this is a perennial issue, again, I know a colleague is going to speak about neighbourhood planning in a moment, and it's not really my area of interest, but I'm a university lecturer, that's never stops you saying anything. Who's engaged? Who are they? And again, neighbourhood planning is an NIMBY charter. I see the consultancy Turley 2014, so I have been reading here. 55% of neighbourhood planning agendas were protectionist and anti-development. And again, we get back to the point, who's involved? How many people are on a neighbourhood forum? How are they elected? How are they nominated? Again, we always hear the phrase usual suspects to define decision makers. My long and less than distinguished career in community regeneration, there are usual suspects amongst the communities as well. And again, there are some real issues there. Nigel will remember the Newcastle NDC tried to look at issues about representation, and I did the, for better or worse, I did the scheme that allowed them to run their own elections for community members. So that Newcastle NDC, for communities that I mentioned earlier, eventually they had their own elections to elect, was it 12, Nigel? Something like that. And in two of the first electoral run-throughs, the turnout for the community representatives was higher than the turnout for a couple of the wards in the local authority. So we have got a track record actually of formal elections for community representatives, and I think it was undertaken by the Electoral Reform Society. Anyway, so just because we have a new generation of activists, issues about elites within communities, elites within neighbourhoods, it remains as a key issue. Finally, moving on, the neighbourhood is dead, long live the neighbourhood. In my old age, I'm getting quite mellow. Looking back at my time with a neighbourhood renewal, it was too top down. And I think, for better or worse, and we'll come to this just in a moment as I sort of conclude, there is a reduction in top down state intervention, prescription regulation. That's the flip side of decluttering the structures, reducing resources, reducing state involvement in targeting initiatives on deprived areas. I've got a few examples. One that I've just put as an EG. By and large, as a consultant and as a board member for a bit, we defined what we thought engagement was and set the local people right. This is how you engage. And for me, a crucial aspect of a neighbourhood approach, which is locally derived and meets local needs, is they define what the terms of engagement should be, and the terms of empowerment. States shouldn't be creating artificial boundaries. I'll not give the game away, but the boundary within which the Newcastle NDC was actually targeted was an interesting process of negotiation. And at the end, one of the planners at Newcastle Council said, "Can we just add a little bit on the riverside there? It'll take in." So neighbourhoods get tired, I think, of someone else defining what neighbourhood they're in, or defining what sort of engagement you should take place in. There's a prescription and regulation within the old system which is now gone, and I think probably that's a good thing. Let me just give you an anecdote, because I've still got a couple of minutes left. The early days of New Deal for Communities, and I chaired this working group, the then ODPM, I think I've got me, yeah, DETR, anyway, it's between DETR and ODPM, said, we think that NDCs should define their own performance indicators, i.e. community-based indicators, and there's a huge literature on that, and they're rooted often in EU practice. And I worked with several residents, and we developed indicators that meant something to local people, and a lot of them were actually community orientated. And we presented it to the then government office, and it went absolutely nowhere, partly because that was deemed as being probably beyond the pale, because it didn't fit with the new public management and the way that the government wishes to monitor poverty, etc. So I think, while there are real drawbacks from less money, less coordination, it does give you actually at least some space. Clearly, the new localist and neighbourhood agenda, it's beyond the former targeted areas. It includes suburban, rural, and I think there was a feeling that for many years a lot of investment was targeted on cities and urban areas, and I think quite rightly places like Northumberland or rural areas felt that they didn't get a fair crack of the whip. At least within this is a more balanced approach across all areas. It's an asset-based model rather than deficit. One of the issues about the previous approaches that did bother me, and it was I remember an occasion where we had a big meeting of residents from NDCs across the northeast, because it was Sunderland, Hartlepool, Newcastle and Middlesbrough, and there was someone from the social exclusion unit there who kept talking to, as you know, being in a deprived community, and this formidable person from Middlesbrough stood up and said, don't you tell me I'm in a deprived community. I don't feel I'm deprived. And so again, this asset-based view, it's not just a deficit model, it's about right to buy, right to build, asset transfer, a whole series of issues about community land trusts, etc. So I just think that seeing neighbourhoods and their assets rather than inherently deficit-based model where they're disadvantaged, they're deprived, they're disempowered. Again, all those things are important. But this issue about seeing something as an asset rather than merely as a deficit. I think there's a more realistic and focused scope for neighbourhood working. I think we tried to achieve too much in the 1990s and 2000s. We expected too much from neighbourhoods. So I think neighbourhoods in terms of planning, co-production of services, voice, etc. I think we've got to be realistic about what neighbourhood working can achieve and whether that's the most appropriate level to undertake a task. And I just think that, for better rather than worse, the more constrained neighbourhood working agenda probably is appropriate. And again, that second point from the bottom, and it was said in quiet terms, somebody who said to me, who was a senior civil servant, think about NDC, it had too much money. In fact, neighbourhood management, which was the coordination of service delivery, which didn't have as much resources, actually was quite successful. And again, I remember giving a lecture on what's a partnership? It's where you suppress mutual loathing in pursuit of cash. And I think that not having money to argue over and to, as one NDC board member said to me, well, they can't tell us what to do with our money, and I felt like saying, it's not really your. So anyway, I think ironically the absence of resources is a major problem, but ironically it does force you back into more uniform ways of working. You're there not because there's money, you're there because you're a member of the neighbourhood and you want to achieve something. And again, the other thing about the ambition, a lot of the research reports I remember reading at the time talking about place-based community governance. What an enormous burden to put on people. We shouldn't be talking about new, exciting forms of governance at neighbourhood level. We want effective neighbourhood working. If it involves forms of governance, fine. But let's not get hung up on devising some major new form of liberal democracy. And seeming no better, and apologies to the planners in the room, that literature on soft spaces, decluttered, absence of existing structures, I think there's considerable scope for innovation. And again, we'll hear today how creative and innovative small schemes can be, where you can occupy perhaps a more uncluttered environment and develop in ways where people are not saying to you, you can't do that because it doesn't relate to X, Y, Z. Right, just to, got 2 minutes? One. Right. Key lessons, sorry, just to reiterate, my own view, neighbourhood working needs to be connected to wider processes, policy areas and skills of governance. Got to be a link between your neighbourhood working and your local authority. I went through the combined authority deals. Of the 10 of them, how many times did I see the word neighbourhood mentioned in the 10 combined authority devolution deals? Am I like to guess? Once, West Midlands. For better or worse, the neighbourhood agenda must be linked into LEPs, combined authorities. There must be a bringing together of the economic and social. Local authorities remain as a key player, and I think the government might think that neighbourhood working is an alternative to local authority provision. It is certainly not. Local authorities are a key partner, still need more resources. And the last 2 points, let citizens define the boundaries of the neighbourhood, what their common interests are, forms of engagement. We've spent 15 years analysing what is a neighbourhood, or 20 years analysing forms of engagement. Just let people get on with it. You know, let a lot of flowers bloom. There will be mistakes made, there will be some problems. Just let's allow more space. And very finally, and this I think is one of the remaining concerns I had about the New Deal for communities, avoid a mismatch between the expectation generated about the benefit of neighbourhood working and the capacities of the parties concerned to deliver it. One of the most problematic aspects is to promise something that can't be delivered. And I think my message is neighbourhood working is still important. It's niche working though within a particular context, but by and large, keep it realistic, keep it feasible. But I think there's real opportunities there.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I've gone on a bit.
I think we're going to take a few presentations and then have enough space to have a conversation rather than sort of. But if there is any kind of immediate question of clarification to Keith that